is a very varied group, but we were discussing at the very end of the last session the possibility of a dialogue, which we must admit is not easy with a group as large as this and as varied as this to get started. It's not the ideal, but but in some sense, it's at least it's relevant because you see, the whole world consists of a number of different people, all who have different professions and opinions and religions and nations and everything, and who can't agree, can't get together to do something. And therefore we're sort of a microcosm of the world. And if we can't do it, of course we don't have enough time, we admit, and so on, but at least we should be able to get the notion of, we may not be able to really do it in this short time, but to get the notion of what it means, which I think is a very important one. And so we shouldn't worry too much if we feel we haven't quite produced the perfect dialogue. Now we have to sort of flounder around perhaps and everything. And as I said, dialogue, the root of the word logos means dia means through, and logos is the word or the meaning. You may think of a flow of meaning in the whole group that's flowing between through, rather than passing back and forth like a tennis ball or a ping pong ball. You see, the point is that in discussion, the word discussion has the root of percussion. It means bouncing the ball back and forth. Right? But that's the most. Otherwise, it could be even more strong than that. But that's the adversarial approach, the approach of argument and debate, which has its place. I mean, I'm not saying we should never do it, but we're saying maybe we want to explore another way, which is really significant for ourselves and for the whole world. Right? And in this other way, we are going to have something flowing among us. Right? And the idea, now the first point is the suspension of your assumptions and opinions. If you remember that assumption is a thought or opinion, but it contains a felt which drives you to express it. You feel a very powerful urge to express it, and immediately, or else you contain the fear of expressing it and you hold back. I mean, and people fall in one or the other, which is this category. Now, so we have this, now we say if that could be suspended, it leaves room for another process to start. We can listen to each other. I think some of the smaller groups have gone into that. And in that space, something different can happen. Now, you see, we may discover that the particular assumptions that we have are not terribly significant, and we have none of them heard. That something else is involved, which is more significant. Even this notion of having a discussion or having bouncing the ball back and forth, the adversarial approach, it's a socio-cultural phenomenon. You see, it's because we've grown up in this sort of culture that we find that natural and inevitable. And in a way, the dialogue exposes socio-cultural assumptions which seem so natural to us, we wouldn't even think they are assumptions. We think they're just the way things are. And the other socio-cultural assumptions may get exposed as we go along. And if some people favor one side and some favor another, a certain amount of tension may develop, which I think is part of the process, right? To resolve that. And by listening and by talking, also we perhaps will develop a skill in holding back a little to give more time for people to respond. Saying, the point is to give everybody a chance not to get their own view across. And so that the skill develops there, and the sensitivity, and the basic. One of the basic thoughts behind it is that this dialogue, or this state of mind between us, is more important than our particular beliefs and opinions and assumptions. That is, you can see that if the world goes on with beliefs, opinions, and assumptions being we really can't get together and do something which is necessary to solve the problems we talked about. Now, I think that dialogue has to do with sharing meaning. In fact, culture generally has to do with the sharing of meaning, both in the sense of partaking of it and taking part in producing it, and communicating it and sharing it. And so we don't have time, unfortunately, to go deeply as I might into what is meaning. You see, we said that, I think that I may have said, that according to the dictionary, meaning has three basic meanings. One is significance, namely what it points to. You see the thing that it refers to. And the second is purpose. I mean to do it means my purpose. And the third is value. It means a lot to me. It means it has a high value. They're all related meanings, because only something of considerable significance that makes a strong purpose or a high value. Only something with a high value has strong purpose, and so on. They're not separate meanings. So now, if we consider these three things, significance, purpose, and value, they go very deep into us. They're a very deep part of our being. And that's to say that we are what we are, and besides that, we have our basic values and purposes and meanings. I know that we could just shift around easily. See, according to what something means, that's what we are, you see. If the world means to us a lot of divided up things, then we are going to be divided in all our thoughts and our responses. We become divided beings because the world means something divided. We act according to what it means. We cannot do other. Meanings can change, as we perceive something new. It's a perceptive act. It's created. And when the meaning changes, the being changes. Now, that we could go into in great length, but we haven't time. I think it affects us physically and mentally. It affects our society. It affects nature. It affects everything, you see. So, therefore, meaning is crucial. And part of our sociocultural tradition is meaning is not all that significant. We are what we are, and then besides that, we have our meanings, which perhaps we think we choose. But in fact, most of our meanings we don't choose. We pick them up from the culture and the society, perhaps when we're very young, very often, and we just simply get on and go on with them, you see, and they affect us deeply and help to make us what we are. Now, therefore, we're not, in some sense, we are not truly individuals, because individual means undivided, and we have a great many meanings. Even the same person may have several conflicting meanings. In fact, we find everybody knows that here. Because of conflicting. The person who is divided has a certain divided being. Right? The meaning of life for him is divided. His being is divided. Now, therefore, meaning is not a thing likely to be shifted around. The meaning has to be seen creatively. And now I wanted to just say one few points about where does it come from. Now, some of our meanings are, and I've just implied that a great many, a large part of our meanings come from the past, from the thought felt, from the society, from the culture. They're sort of stuck in our memory, in our habits, in our relationships, and perhaps in our muscular attitudes, and so on. Now, that would be a sort of a mechanical meaning which conditions us. Right? So we act according to what things mean, and what things mean gets conditioned. An assumption will condition our meaning. We may have to fix it for certain purposes, but if it gets really too fixed, for the reasons we were discussing last days, then our being is affected. And then, but then I say meaning might arise perceptibly fresh. So where would that come from? You see, that's a difficult question. You see, if you say there's nothing but this process of thought, felt, and memory, which in fact is implied by a great deal of what's going on in, say, some scientific circles and artificial intelligence and so on, then you say, well, that's it. We could hope to change the programs, and that's all, somehow. That's all right. I want to suggest when some new meanings appear, creative meanings, from deeper, more subtle levels of being, going on ultimately to the unlimited, which we discussed. So, see, previously we sort of had the unlimited and then we had the limited. They sort of just were stuck together or sitting side by side. But in fact, I think there's sort of a gradation between them in order. That can be called the intricate order. Many of you may be familiar with that. And it's steadily unfolding, becoming more extricate, more manifest, and visible physically or in simple thoughts, feelings, and the in actions. So, and in the form of society. And the so it's unfolding meaning, as you said. It also enfolds and unfolds, right? Now the okay, so and that meaning is being. Now yes, it's what I've also called elsewhere the generative order, the order in which it's all generated, rather than it's the sort of closer to the source of the stream and so on. And if pollution, you see, if false, confused meanings go in close, far down, and up the stream, then it affects everything. Now, so there's an order which I will call an order of subtlety, an order of unfoldment. The word subtle means, elusive and intangible and definable, highly refined. But its root meaning is finely woven in Latin. Now, that's a good meaning, I think, because we have to say that the mind has to get to a finely woven level to go deep. It cannot catch it with a coarse net. And the ordinary thoughts are a rather coarse net compared with what's needed. Therefore, subtlety is needed. Subtlety is not possible if the mind is constantly jarred and disturbed by all these things we talked about. So it's got to quiet down. Listening is part of subtlety. Because you have to listen to what is subtle, right? Not just to what is obvious, right? That produces a different kind of mind. You see, a mind which is beginning to turn attention deeper toward the subtle, toward the source, all of us together. Now, you can do that by yourself, of course, with a few people. But we're not proposing something which has rarely happened to have a large group of people do it together, which I think what adds a new dimension to it. And also, it's very important for the state of the world because it becomes the nucleus of a different kind of culture, different meaning, a different culture, you see. We can call it a microculture because it's very small, whereas we have the general culture with its subcultures. And the general culture, we said, is confused and it's got a lot of dissolution and so on. It's not really healthy. So we say we want to experiment with a healthy microculture. You see, this is not therapeutic in the usual sense of treating individuals. See, in fact, none of what I've been saying has been intended as therapy during this weekend. But it's really a way of looking for insight into what's going on. And though perhaps somebody might say it's related to therapy, but that would be some side issue for what I'm discussing now. And and if there's any therapy involved, it's the therapy of the culture and the society, making it whole healthy. And so we say we can't begin with the whole society. We can begin with ourselves, perhaps, but we then begin with a smaller group. It has to be large enough to really work, to contain a number of subcultures. Because just in the conflict of the subcultures and working that out is one of the key steps. You begin to realize that a great deal of your being is not your own. It's the subculture of which you are a representative. And you see, in other words, we have a false notion of our individuality. True individuality would only come when we are moving from the unlimited. But insofar as we're moving from all this conditioning, we have a whole mass of things in us which is divided. Therefore, we're saying, okay, we have meaning. Meaning not only individually, but perhaps together, emerging by attention to the subtler level, which also shows in the way we behave and act and relate to each other. So that whatever is happening outside is happening inside and vice versa. If there's a conflict outside of this group, there will be a conflict inside each one of us, which we will be aware of. And it doesn't belong only to one person, you see. And that's true out in all society, of course, but we're starting in a microcosm. And and then we say maybe a new kind of mind emerges in which we don't have this division between us. Right? It doesn't mean that you are being put in a mob or forced, mob or Nuremberg rallies or anything like that, or pressure to conform. But rather, each individual is quite free, but that individual himself sees the necessity of this, of putting first this, at least in this context, the possibility of being together, of this, what I call the impersonal fellowship, which means participation. It means participation means the two meanings, not only taking part in and adding to it, making a contribution, but also partaking of. Namely, in your own mind, you partake of this flow meaning, right, which is, as it were, nourishes you, but you give some back in a changed way. And the idea then is this would be, at least for modern times, who knows whether it happened in hunter-gatherer societies very long ago, or in faraway places, but it would be something which I don't think has happened in modern times in a large group. It's not to my knowledge. Perhaps not for 1,000 years, I don't know, more, that's longer. See, without authority, every person, because without hierarchy, the hierarchy and the authority, you have it now only in yourself. You see, it's this culture. We are members of cultures which are hierarchical and bureaucratic, and therefore we are that way. Right? So we may feel impelled to act that way as we start thinking of who's up and who's down, and who has the right to talk and doesn't, and so on. You see, all of that is irrelevant. Right? We may find that this thing still works in us, but gradually as we work it, we'll see it, maybe we start getting free of it. So it's really quite a different, this sort of society has seldom, in fact, people have mentioned the Quaker meeting in that general direction. I think but I think this goes further. Now I don't know if I've said all that should be said. I mean, I think if any of the other people, we've discussed it among us, and some of us, and if any of the others want to say something to add to it before we get started, or if anybody wants to make a comment.
In effect, are we trying to act as a vehicle for the higher self to tell us what to do?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I say we don't. At the moment, our purpose is just simply to be able to talk freely together about whatever is important. You see, we don't have a fixed aim, because that would make every fixed aim is an assumption. We have a sort of a general aim, which is we've got to learn to talk together and create this new mind. Right? I think this in itself would be a tremendous thing.
I had a thought just to add early on, if I may as well. I'll just underline the idea of listening that you mentioned. Listening for the subtle rather than the obvious, which I think is essential in the process. I also think that we begin with quite a hierarchical structure, because that's the society that we're in. But the movement is towards realizing that everyone has equal value. Initially, it might not seem to be the case. And David mentioned, for example, leaving space to allow those who may speak less frequently, or less easily, or less quickly to do so, and various other things. But I think all those point in the direction of eventually coming to the experiential realizing of each person's value individually in the collective whole. And I can see that one of our handicaps here is that we have hierarchical structure in relation to David, for example, which is natural because we're drawn to come to be near him. But it will also be a factor in our movement into dialogue, because it's not only the adversarial approach, which is different from dialogue, for example, but it's also the question-answer approach, which is different. And the extent to which we ask, well, David, what do you think about this? It may have a place in the dialogue. It seems to me often that that's a small part of it. And I've noticed a reseeding of questioning generally as a process of dialogue proceeds. Not questioning of others, put it that way. That there may be questions to the whole, but less so to a single authority. And so I say, I don't think we can just say, well, now we'll just act as if David didn't carry some particular position, because he does. But also, some loosening of that will be necessary, I think, to take some steps in that direction.
Yeah, I would just add that people should begin generally to start addressing questions either to the group as a whole or to particular people you want to address them to.
I have a basic difficulty about understanding the mechanics of how one starts the dialogue. If the idea is to suspend one's own opinions, assumptions, etc., who then speaks and expresses himself?
That's what you will find out.
Yeah. I have experience of meetings of trained counsellors. Now, the trouble with trained counsellors is that they are all trained to listen, and nobody expresses an opinion or makes a decision.
Well, don't do that. I mean, start talking normally, but just to each other, and say what you want to say. I don't think we're having a dialogue right away. See, we may become self-conscious, like the centipede who thinks, how is he moving his hundred legs? The point is, just start. This idea of dialogue is now in your mind. Just leave it there, you see, and talk. Don't focus on me, right?
Yeah.
And then you will find problems arising as you do it, and you will start facing those problems. Right?
I think one of the things for me is attempting to feel, or being prepared to feel a shift, to feel part of the larger whole. So I'm very ambitious. I want to feel part of the larger whole of the whole world. And I spent a lot of the early part of my life not feeling at home in the world. I was very conscious that I didn't feel at home in the world. And I've just been to Australia and Hong Kong, and I always feel extremely English when I'm abroad. I always feel, England's the place to be, and coming back I feel, Cotswolds and it's all lovely in London, so on. And also I felt particularly antagonistic towards Australia because my sister, I've only got one sister, emigrated there. I felt a lot of antagonism towards Perth in Australia. But when I was there, I suddenly got a feeling in Australia, perhaps Australia is also part of my world. You couldn't get further away from that. But I don't have to feel so English. I could feel part of the planet. Then I wouldn't have to feel this antagonism towards Australia, which was lessened this time. That was really quite a considerable shift for me, really. If it would be possible not only to feel part of this group, I don't know if I could feel part of this group yet, whether we've got time to do that. But that's part of being a part of the whole planet. I would really like to be able to identify with it all.
Feelings of the kind you're describing probably due to fear. Fear in terms of fear of fear.
You mean I'm not I'm English when I'm abroad. Yeah.
Or might it not be something to do with one's own need to protect one's own sense of identity, to which in your instance you give the name English, and in my instance I give another name. I can't think of the moment. Well, even my own name, Don. I mean, I am me, and there's a part of me that wants to protect that and thus keep at arm's length that which is not me, or which I assume is not me. When I move into a group situation, I'm confronted with a kind of a conflict where I want to be part of the group, but I don't want to give up my identity and my ego, not my Freudian ego, but my egotism, feels threatened by the possibility of losing my individuality. What happens, or has happened, of course, is that I don't lose my individuality when I do become part of the group. Mm-hmm. But my egotism isn't at all pleased with that and doesn't accept it, so it has to be convinced each time.
Is that not also a defense mechanism against becoming part of a crowd as opposed to part of a group? Because in the crowd you do lose your identity temporarily in that of the crowd, whereas in the group your identity can take on another facet in relation to the group.
I'd like to suggest that there's a poem by Kipling, of all people, which copes with this problem and rather neatly sums up what I take to be David's general philosophy. It's called The Threshold, and it's in his last work called Limits and Renewals. He is pointing out how real human thought and approach to truth was first formulated by the Ionian philosophers, Thales and so in about 600 BC. And the belief that they came to this: we find one breath in all things, but those all things between. We find one matter in all things, eternal, changeless, unseen. But the heart of the matter is single, till the breath shall bring to birth, by losing and choosing and losing its neighbor, all things made upon earth. That doesn't exactly make sense, because there aren't any neighbors while the thing is one. But the thing modulates itself into neighbors, which thereupon proceed to choose or lose one another. This is how everything comes into being. I think if you think of the matter in the guise of an extremely high frequency carrier wave, with an urge to self-modulation, you'll find this makes sense. But the eye, there are several eyes, and the further apart they are, the lower the frequency of their communications. And I think you'll find that this makes sense as an organic unity. I don't know what David thinks about that.
Or what anybody else thinks.
What? I didn't hear you. Did you say something?
I put it to you because I wanted to find out whether it did correspond.
Well, yes, it sounds nice in the line, yes. It is in that line.
I think one could develop the idea in talking about frequency quite usefully, as an analogy that low frequency tends to be divided and higher frequency tends to be.
That is so. I mean, when you would say that a meter is 100 centimeters, what you really mean is the frequency of your awareness of the centimeter marks on the edge of a ruler is 100 times faster than that of your awareness of the meter marks. That's, in my view, what the experiential meaning of the statement is. But you've got to put the thing upside down. High frequency is small scale.
I think also the idea of high frequency indicating what subtleness is.
Yes.
That at a level of subtlety there is a singleness.
But the only thing is we don't appreciate the subtlety until we've appreciated the non-subtlety. So you've got in a sense to fragment before you can see the point of going back home, or going homewards a bit.
No differentiation that goes one way, which is from a spiritual side. I feel the longing to the differentiation of being able to express physically, and then as a physical being, I feel a longing to feel my presence ethereally, and I almost feel like there's this growing into and growing back of almost wanting to meet in the middle, the kind of unfolding and experiencing the luxury of touch and the things that one can only experience at a very physical level.
The physical level is high frequency, though. Touch in the inner awareness of matter.
I know, so there's a kind of duality between high and low frequency, because we talk about high frequency because we can't measure the things that we feel are there, like the communication which we can't measure on our meters. We expect that maybe somewhere in the gap that we can't measure, there's something wonderful happening where it would all be if we could measure it. So we call high frequency the things that we can't touch, and yet there's, in a way, their subtlety feels to me does not permit some of the, and I can only use the word luxury of the physical world.
I'd like to extend that to comment on the personality. My own feeling is that the growth of frequencies could be likened to those of judging. I think we all have an inner judge that pushes us around. But also, if that energy is allowed to rise, it can rise through analysis, through the mind, into something that's much subtler, which might be described as discrimination.
Yes.
But it's the same energy, but we just need to allow it to rise so we can discriminate rather than judge all the time.
One thing I think we need to also be cautious about with models like this is whether we're not carrying a way of thought suited in one realm into another realm. We've just got to be, I think, a little cautious when we use the term frequency. Have we sneakingly got in our minds a frequency of something which, although we don't admit it, is like matter but very fine? Do you know what I mean? Somehow, when we use these pictures, I think one's got to be a little cautious how one's using them. You see what I mean? There can be certain hidden assumptions which we can carry over from where they have an explicit meaning and where we understand very well. We very easily carry some of the assumptions from that realm into another realm we're trying to describe with this language, you know.
But have you a clear conception of the carrier wave?
Certainly have as an electronics engineer, very clear conception. But it's a conception in electronics.
Yes.
Yes, I think what was mentioned about the fact that there are gradations between what one would call the core and the unlimited. There are gradations of timeless. I think what's probably for me most useful about the image of the frequency is that it points out that what we really are is not a thing, but a process. And what's going on, what we are is not a thing which is attached to anything. I'm English, I'm female, or whatever, or more something. But to point out that what's really going on is a process. Yeah. And I think that in that way one can see that an analogy like that can actually encompass all different layers, if you understand that sort of process. So what's going on all the time is a kind of action.
I love the word rhythm.
Yeah.
I suppose one could even invoke the particle wave duality as a metaphor. Often we have to see ourselves as process, but other times it's useful for me to be male and American, and those objects are particle-like things.
That's
process, both there, not one and not two. It is to me, it's subtle.
It's a wonderful concept that some medieval rulers had, that I and the people are one.
Whitman.
Sorry?
Sounds like Whitman.
Well, Louis the 14th.
People would want to say that. I was thinking that I found the limited and the unlimited way of expressing something made me think that what I really love is to, I've discovered, is to move in between those two states, and that in myself. And I think one way I describe that is sometimes I seem to have a very small outlook. I'm very involved in little things at home or internal processes or something, or rather mundane things. And then there comes a largening of vision, and I feel very connected with say this group here, and then maybe something even larger. But it moves all the time. It's moving backwards and forwards, and that's I think that's very satisfying and very beautiful. And I wonder if it isn't stressful to try and always be one thing or the other in an arbitrary way. I mean, like we really ought to always be thinking about the whole world, and we shouldn't ever think about small, my personal world. And likewise, I think it's very stressful to just be so self-centered, you could say, that you never take in anything larger in a deeper way. But to move between the two is something very natural to life, very, very fulfilling.
It's very important, sort of rhythm again, isn't it? Yeah, rhythm in our life, rhythm in our awareness.
And I think the same applies to moving between the spiritual and the physical. I would like to say, echo your comments in that context as well, between the two. Because the problems that have been specifically mentioned this weekend are problems of the world. The environment, pollution, wars, these are very much, they have a very much a physical content, a material content, this material world, as well as having a spiritual side. I think it's important not to get too much on the one side or the other side, but to try to blend the two in a solution, seeking a solution.
It is perhaps the space of dialogue, in a sense, or dialectic. We're talking about spirit and matter, or limited and the unlimited, or process and thing, and we're moving towards keeping a dynamic rhythm between these two priorities. And this is what the whole process is about.
Yes, I have a question. Because I've been reading recently about the Gnostics, and somebody mentioned the Gnostic view. Of course, it's very different from the sort of early Greek view, which is based on the cosmos as a kind of harmonious thing. We are sort of macrocosm of that macrocosm. But the Gnostic view was really that that we're aliens, that the cosmos is something that's been created in error, and therefore it's a mistake to think that we can in any way identify with it. I think when we talk about the planet, we tend to think of a sort of, something which to us is a kind of whole. But the Gnostic view, as I've tried to understand it, is that it's really the opposite of being at home in this world. It's to realize that we're not at home in this world. The world was created in error and out of ignorance of the greater whole, which would really come from the pleroma, which is it's non-physical, and you can't really speak about it. But the idea is that we will have some kind of spark within us, which is actually part of this pleroma, and the idea there is that if we have that knowledge or gnosis, then we can return to the pleroma and
restore it. That's very different from the early Greek view of us being at home in this universe. And I'm interested in how this links up with David's ideas of the integral order, because I think, then we fall into talking about the planet, looking after the planet. The idea of the integral order would be that the planet itself would then be part of some greater order, which is something that we can't reach, and certainly isn't concrete or material in the ordinary everyday sense.
That's what David called the cosmic, I think, yesterday. And also, one perhaps needs to add that it wasn't all Greeks who felt themselves at home. The whole Platonic tradition is to feel that one is in exile from the good and from the world of being, and one's serving sort of penal sentence down here until one gradually works one's way back through a series of incarnations to the realm of the good.
But that would be to get in touch with the harmonies, let's say, in the heavens, wouldn't it?
Not in an earthly sense, no.
I'd like to heckle that. I think that this is true. This was a Gnostic view. They were Manichaean. But Plato thought that his people being in the cave were in an inferior situation. I would question that. I think that if the people were out in the full sunlight, they would see nothing at all. There wouldn't be anything to see. They want some shadows in order to see things. And the manifestation of the shadows is the way in which the pleroma manifests itself. By choosing and losing its neighbors, it makes things. But it destroys them again immediately. But it goes on making them destroying them, making them destroying them.
It doesn't know what it is without its shadow, if I'm following your analogy.
Yes, that is roughly true.
I'm in a position where we're now just blinking in the bright light. Things have moved on a bit since Plato.
But the point of the analogy there is that one comes back into the cave and then sees 10,000 times more clearly.
You try to persuade the people in the cave that what they're actually seeing is shadows, and they won't listen to you.
And shall they not take you, and shall they not crucify you?
That's right. You get on with your life as best you can.
Thinking of the example, I don't know if this is true, but I heard somebody say that, I'm sure it is true actually, that people who do Tai Chi, or I think it was Tai Chi or some martial art, that the real masters can just do it in their mind. So they can sit there doing whatever they're doing and be going through the actions. And I'm just trying to explore further into this thing of the differentiation, the need to come to a manifest place with the luxury of touch and with the shadows to watch one's movements and to know oneself. And thinking that another way to see why we come to watch the shadows is that the person who learns Tai Chi does spend hours and hours learning the movement. I've forgotten the form, I think they call it. But then I guess gets to know it so well that they can just practice it at a more subtle level, perhaps in the mind. So perhaps we come to the cave to practice the differentiation of our movement of the form of existence or being, that we may practice it in a more subtle way.
One thing about talking about the cable separation or anything like this, I mean, one thing that is clear is that one of the things that is so very interesting about, say, the way of science is, certainly the David's work in science, is that what he points toward is a way of seeing that, if you like, what is unlimited and what is limited are actually part of a single whole. I think this point in singleness. And that there's a real sense there, which I'm not going to try and encapsulate or give all of this, but there's a real sense of understanding that actually you don't understand what the differentiated world is without knowing that wholeness, and vice versa. Yeah? And so it's when things have moved on since Plato, it's, one can look at what those people were saying, which were great insights. But in the context of the present day, we have this kind of, one can only be grateful for something which, if you like, gives one a way of understanding that particular situation. I'm not sure I'm saying this particularly clearly. It does seem a real sense that what comes out is what you're talking about, the appreciation of what the sensible world is. Yeah? We can't really know that unless we also know its wholeness.
And we certainly can't know it so long as we're regarding the sense of the tangible world as bad and as different and separate from the intangible. So that's when we screw it, I think.
Yes. Well, that's one thing.
And vice versa.
We have to actually know that wholeness.
One meaning of oneness could be that in experience, you say between the spiritual and material world. See, I don't really think in those terms, although I know what you mean. But I feel that we can unify the different dimensions, the gradation, if you like, and then there is oneness, because we know that. There isn't a separation between all these different things. Yeah, however you want to put it, unlimited and limited, man and woman and spirit and all these things. They're all unified actually in our experience.
Even in relation to science, I'm not sure if we will go one way and the other way. By the caves, so they would have a crude science. They would predict how these shadows would be going this way and that way. So I think there's a sort of an analogy to quantum mechanics, for example, which is, I think, David's unhappiness with quantum mechanics was exactly because you couldn't discuss the individual shadows. You could only give the statistics of the probabilities. And maybe it's a sort of same situation that people are very happy with a science that doesn't really want to discuss why are these shadows this way.
I think the basis of that too is that all modern science measures in terms of integers. But the numerals that they use for measuring were originally devised to denote multiplicities. But when they're used for measuring magnitudes, they actually function as they indicate ratio of magnitude measured to the unit of measurement. They should indicate ratios, and we're using the multiplicity word all the time to denote ratios. And that's where it largely goes wrong. Quantum comes in there. No quantum in nature. Quantum comes in measurement. I found this first when I started investigating how we got the units of time. There's a New Testament text which gives the clue. It's in 2 Peter 3:8. And it says, "Know ye not that with God 1,000 ages are as a day, and a day as 1,000 ages." First part we know very well from our God help in ages past. Second part nobody's noticed. But it's there. And it shows very clearly that what Peter's doing is to use the day as the paradigm of the short time. Relative. And we look around us and think, well, how the devil the hell? I went to the Science Museum to find out. And there, I discovered without any doubt, the second was invented by Huygens in around roughly 1670. Before then, there was no periodic time shorter than the day. The hour had been sort of made by distincting day, and the minute was the most comminuted time. That's how it gets its name. It's minute.
1760, was it?
No, 1670. 1670 by Huygens put the second on the clock.
Could I bring us back to dialogue, please, by raising just an imperfect point about hastening it? Not particularly here, but in general. that my personal aim in that matter, in that process, is to think of the other person or the other group, or the members of the group, as being stranded with me in an emergency situation out in the universe somewhere. And we're so clearly human beings, we've got so much in common, that that's a terrific thing that we can sort of work on to make progress with. Okay?
We're stranded right here.
Well, I'm not pushing anything. I just first with that particular thing, throw it in, and anybody else has got any like feelings or any development from that, or see any practical use of it to visualise this lot over in Mars. We've just been dumped there, and we've got such a lot in common. It sort of brings that out for me. I'd be very pleased to meet any misbehaving adolescent there. If I was stranded by myself, spiritually and physically. Anyway, that's it. I'm hardly developing. I'll just throw it in case it's in use.
Thank you very much for that, David. I'd like to use it if I may in a guided imagery workshop sometime.
I have a slightly different image, but it's just really from experience. When I started from New York and travelled first to Europe, where I felt very American, and I couldn't read the signs on the shops, and so they were all in French. And then later on, not very much later, to find myself at the origins of our way back, our experience, all of our experience, which was living in the same age, and finding that they were so terribly foreign, so very exotic and alien to me, and then eventually, bit by bit, finding myself more at home with them, then eventually feeling that I actually could understand their behaviour and almost really to be able to predict it, that which once seemed totally unpredictable, so I so little understood it, after 4 expeditions anyway. And then I was very struck by the fact that I had lived in Europe and found myself not feeling American at all, feeling more or less kind of Western civilized. And then discovering at a certain point when I went to Australia and then to Southeast Asia, where I'd never seen that sort of person, Asians, Orientals, and finding, much to my pleasure, that they didn't look foreign at all. And the reason that they didn't look foreign by then was that these gaps that I had experienced between a sense of reality about people and a sense of identity with them, feeling that they were entirely human, had been bridged by the fact that I had got to feel at home with the furthest away ones, which were the Stone Age ones, so that everything in between then became brothers and sisters. Did my best.
I thought it was interesting to follow up on what you said before. Our group number 3 yesterday began, somehow happened, some relationship developed into a discussion of the fear of intimacy. And it was interesting the way, at first, it seemed to be a subject that we had never heard of before. And then it became something that we all were part of, and we could discuss freely. And it was quite a shift there, and it was very interesting. And what I was wondering is why it's so difficult to make a shift here. Are we afraid that we have so much in common? There is a fear here of something. Is it a fear of intimacy? What are we afraid of?
No.
I feel it.
Okay, what are you afraid of? Why don't we start there?
Well, I didn't say I was afraid, but I said I felt fear around me. The only thing I'm afraid of is that I would like to know you all better. I would like to go away from here with some shared feelings and meanings. And my fear is that I won't do it.
It's a big jump from 1 to 15.
Yeah, right. But that doesn't frighten me in that sense, because I realize that if it's going to happen, it's not going to be me that's going to convince you to be intimate with me.
I think there's a bit of a distinction here, because I think what we're creating amongst all of us isn't the sort of normal, natural, personal intimacy, and maybe it's something a little more detached and a little more impersonal, but it's still intimacy, and I think it's a slightly different experience.
You don't believe it includes the idea, which was expressed before, that we have a lot in common?
Yes.
You don't believe, or you do believe?
I do think we have a lot in common, but I think we are used to putting that in certain ways, having to get to really know somebody on a certain level, like the same, doing certain things together to actually know that person. So I think we can get to know each other in a slightly different point of view.
In a personal way.
Yeah.
Do you think we have to make the effort, or just cause it to happen?
Well, I think we have to participate. Yeah, I think we have to individually participate,
right. Okay.
Which is what we do.
Overcome the fear.
Right.
So that it's there, and we have to do something to make it safe to be together, and then to make it safe to be together a little bit more closely. But all the time there's a kind of thing. I mean, could we not sort of put it the other way and say we are together, we're totally trustworthy and trusting, unless we're betrayed, and then we retract. In other words, start with entire trust, and then, I mean, it's another way of arriving at whatever the Right. I think I have to get over my suspicion as a human race, basically. I mean, I don't know that I feel a straight oneness with the human race. I kind of struggle with this throughout my life. And I mean, in some ways I feel more at home and identified with animals than I do with people, because they seem more authentic.
I feel that, and instantly you said it, of course I don't feel it. But, and I understood what you said when you said you're not frightened, but you feel fear. And when I just looked at that, the flash that came was kind of ran around a bit for a little while. And the flash that came was, what is, we discovered that all of what I say is me is the same as you. So all those, and that would be terrible. And my suggestion out of that is that what I say is me, and this came up yesterday night, and then we got very clear that we are our thoughts and opinions, didn't we? It was very clear to us. But then, if we found we had the same thoughts and opinions at some level, then we'd have to look somewhere else for who we are, and we might, if we have to commune at the level of something beyond our thoughts and opinions, we might have to accept that at some level our thoughts and opinions are the same, and that's a pretty scary thing.
Because you didn't make the next point. Well, I mean, the human race obviously does such horrendous things, and I feel very nervous about the human race.
I know, but I mean the poisonous snake, operating within it.
Yeah.
The salt belt sort of syndrome, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Nature.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Could I interject something?
Nature has put us here for some purpose. All of us are separate. It may be an illusion, but we're in the illusion of separateness. Maybe this fear is a defense reaction. We realise that we're supposed to be separate. On the other hand, we're going back to reality with it as well. We're really all one, and we really know it deep down. But we have these defense reactions, and we have to resolve this problem, don't we? But perhaps the reason why we're here separate is because information input is limited, so we can deal with it and we're fully conscious. Whereas if we go back to the implicit reality, have a mystical experience, information input is very much on overload, it's infinite, we lose our consciousness, and all we've got is joy and bliss and light, and that's no real life at all, is it?
I had an experience yesterday which I'd like to share, following on what you're saying, because it has to do with this. I think I was saying something, and I sort of apologized to myself. I said that's awfully personal. Somebody else said to me, "What's awful about being personal?" So I began to examine that as I was speaking, and I realized that at that moment it was absolutely fine, because this was the group part of this group was extremely safe and trustworthy, and in that context it was actually delightful to be myself, to be personal at that moment, and well, enjoy that.
This is transcending paradox, isn't it? Isn't that nice?
I enjoyed it then, and I enjoy it now, in the sense that when we have a cohesive group, I think we should give ourselves a bit more credit in the sense that
this is a small group. You know,
this is a bigger group.
What you were describing yesterday was a small group, as I referred to, and there were a few of us, and I felt that we were becoming more intimate in a very good sense. I think in a large group like this, that intimacy, and what you're calling being personal, is not actually very easily attainable. And I would think that it's not the problem isn't that we're frightened of being intimate. The problem is that we want to be intimate. It's the longing for intimacy which could actually prevent us from having a dialogue.
That is very interesting. There is a Sufi story, a lot, about the dog which was thirsty and approached a pond to drink. And when it looked in the pond, it saw a dog advancing towards it with open jaws. It started to bark. It couldn't drink. The owner had to push it in.
Then it's dry.
Could I raise a point of order? Could I raise a point of order? And I'm addressing it to you as Peter suggested, as timekeeper on the group. I'm a fast person myself. I'm nevertheless extremely impressed by the speed of this conversation. I'm finding that I don't sense a listening going on any longer. I sense an immediate reaction, and I feel at this moment like I'm at Wimbledon, turning my head as the balls rush past in this tennis match. And the point of order is it possible for us all to leave a beat or two between contributions, to allow time for what's been said just to sink in before reaction? Because I think even in the last 10 minutes, the speed of this conversation has accelerated to a phenomenal degree. And I think sound rather than light is beginning to be the predominant motive.
Particle acceleration.
Particle acceleration.
Strong duality. Yes, I suggest also on some point of order that if anybody would like to need to go out for a few minutes now or for a few seconds, then they should do so. And if anybody, perhaps we just get up for a stretch for a couple of minutes, and as you raise.
Just quickly, if my voice sounds a little tense, it's simply because one of the great lessons I've learned from the last hour or so is never sit in the middle of the court in a tennis match. I had two reflections in the interest of the dialogue. One was on the fear, which was discussed, and the other one was on individuality. And first, the reflection on fear. David said in his introduction to this session that what might be the result of successful dialogue is a new mind. And I believe that raises immediately a fear, the fear of not reaching the potential, the possibility of an occasion. And I believe this is a fear which exists in any group which is dedicated to this kind of process. But I also think it exists in the world as a fear of people not reaching what they believe is the potential of the destiny of their lives. concerned with a new mind. I feel that we're concerned with tapping into the source of something which is very old, and which is the source of us all, and the life of us all. And that if we think in terms not so much of reaching the next step, but maybe in terms of getting back to the basis of ourselves, so that the higher self, so that we're in contact with the higher self of each of us, which illuminates us. That's our commonality. That's what we apply to new situations. That's what gives us new approaches and new results from a common mind. And that takes away any fear from me, because I know I'm not tapping into something or reaching for something new. I know that I'm tapping into something I already know, and which is at the very root of my being. And that gives me a terrific surety of how to continue. That's the first point. The second point concerns individuality. And I found myself, while we were talking, of making a duality. And on one line, I was writing words like spiritual, collective, higher, and world mind. And then on the other level, I was writing words like physical, individual, mundane, self-mind. And what I was conscious of, and remain conscious of, is that if you tap into this higher self, which is the source and which illuminates everybody, then that in itself has an effect on the physical, on the individual, mundane aspects of ourselves, but gives it greater value. At that point, the thought-mind loop, which many of us have been discussing in the last couple of days, suddenly becomes not a degenerative movement, but actually a regenerative movement. And that if I can be conscious all the time of what my higher self is, and I've had enough training in my life to recognize it when it comes, when it appears. If I can recognize that, then it raises all my mundane considerations to a higher level, and therefore makes them valuable in the interest of dialogue. And I sense that the historical contributions to the discussion so far have been extremely valuable in looking at the source of that continuous higher self which people have tried to interpret. But I think only if we look at it in terms of the higher self raising the lower self to the way that a dialogue can really continue, our common mind exists to the degree that we can be in touch with our higher selves. And silence, of course, is one of the ways to do it.
I like your point about fear, because I would tend to normally think of the fear of being fear of, not fear of possibly not achieving, but fear of something else that's personal. But I do know that when I look at taking on something that I might not achieve, I'm very loath to even start it. And that's something what Noel was saying, that we might not get there, so let's not even start. I was aware in the previous session of I have a choice of how I see myself in this group, and I have a choice. Looking around at the faces, I noticed that I was able to either, and the first thing that would arise in my mind is to look at the differences and to look at what I would criticize in each body around me. But I have the choice equally to look at what I love in each body around me, and that's something that I have to do consciously. And it was at that point that I realized, why am I not willing to be personal and intimate in this group when we are all of us acknowledgedly here with a common purpose? We may have different ways of wanting to reach that, but we have the commonality which is in the higher self. And for me, dialogue is always personal. I may bring in theories to support it, but it's always I feel this because, or I think this because my experience is this and this. And I would like this session for myself and all of us to be willing to be more personal, to share experiences of our own rather than theories that we're interested in considering. I feel that would be useful.
I'd like to add to that something personal, because my personal feeling is that there must be fear, or perhaps anxiety is a better word, when one reaches out, whether one achieve what one was trying to do. So something happened to me in the coffee break before the last session, actually. But I was talking to my friend, making a rather large gesture, and somebody walked past and smiled at me, and I said, well, did you hear what I was saying? And he said, no, but you've got a nice smile on your face. And so I went on with what I was saying, and I don't know whether we actually communicated in words or not. It doesn't really matter, maybe we didn't, because this person came in after the little dialogue was got going. But there's two things: the reaching out and the smile speaks, and something happens there. So you can forget about the anxiety once something's been achieved. But I feel that there has to be some, if it's going to have value, there's got to be anxiety about whether it's going to work or not. You can't have it without fear or anxiety, whatever, until you make the contact with the good.
There's another level of fear for me too, which alongside this one, the fear of whether or not we'll make what we're going for, which has meaning. And of course, not to reach what we're going for because it has meaning is painful. But also for me, this tremendous fear of the prospect of new mind is to open to the experience of new mind actually means the death of what I know, which is old mind. That is dead dodgy for me. I don't know about anybody else, but that is cool. That's actually much more frightening. And what I tend to do is sabotage getting there, and then saying, "Oh, wasn't it a pity that we didn't make it? And isn't it painful? And we've got to come back and try again, right?" But actually, I'll sabotage it again because what I'm really afraid of is that death.
Perhaps when we look at new mind, I know for myself, it's the question of life experience. What I've learned at a university, what I've read out of a book, is great. But what does my life say? What does my life experience tell me? What is the unlimited part of myself that I know intrinsically is correct or good, if those words have any value? What is that saying? And I guess that's something that I found missing this weekend here, is there's been, even for myself, I mean, I haven't been willing to look at my life experience and share that because of, I don't know what the reason was, but we all seem to be so caught up in what we know, what we've learned out of a book. But is that really what's valuable to us? Or is that where dialogue can come from? Or does dialogue have to come from what we know to be true because we've lived it, not because we've read about it or because some famous person wrote about it?
Only picking up on what you said, from a positive side, no. I've also sensed that a lot of people here who have had experienced a great deal in their inner work, in their inner life, a lot that could be shared, but there's a certain tact that people feel about them. There are people here who come from quite different spiritual directions. We've several times said we sense a certain community as well. We sense that we're all here out of some commonality. But we also recognize that that commonality is at a certain level. And sort of sticking like icebergs out of this common level is the particular, if you like, point where we are. And a very nice picture was I once heard about the relationship of the higher and the lower ego. Or the higher self and the lower self, or what's me now as I'm conscious of it and all that I'm not conscious of. It was rather like this. If you imagine the starry heaven, you imagine all the stars there, and there's one star amongst all those stars that I don't have. I share all the rest with everybody else. So if you like, my individuality arises from that star I don't have, not that star I do have. It's quite an interesting picture. I mean, a picture either grows in you or it dies in you. One's free with a picture and accepts it as a theory. This is a picture that in me has grown. And I have felt, for instance, when I first read David's work on wholeness and implicate order, I felt somehow that all that which I shared with everybody else was implicated. It was that with which I was not yet conscious. I'd explicated that little bit which corresponds to the star I've taken away almost. It's gone. I don't share it with them. And I just wonder if we can't take further this approach. I mean, David answered some of these rather difficult questions that were being put to him yesterday about, well, what is life, the universe, and everything almost with the doctor. And he countered with this very interesting paradox about limitation and unlimited. And I think that, that leads us in this direction. I feel we all do share that of which we're not yet conscious. We're aware of that. But we all have our own, this one star we don't have, which we're a bit shy about now. And I think there's also something very positive in this group, that we haven't trampled upon each other and hurled our personal spiritual points of view at each other. I think there's been a tremendous tolerance and holding back and listening in the group. That's perhaps another side to what you described.
I guess my only question is, why do we tend as individuals to cloak our experience by saying someone famous said it? I mean, why as a group of people do human beings tend to need to say, instead of it's their experience, what do they need to say? Plato said it, or Jung said it, or Freud said it, or someone that the name means something. I guess that's my question. Instead of saying, why do I know it to be true in my life for myself?
There's a program, sorry, I'm not keeping that couple of seconds, but I just wanted to say this. There's a program I'm aware of in myself, and I suspect some other people may have it, which is that I would very much rather not lay myself open to the risk of having it be shown that my spirituality is less than yours, or my apprehension of the world and my understanding of what's truly so is not as good as yours. Or to put a specific example in this weekend, that was a part of my ego. I've got a program running which would very much like me to be the one who understands David's thoughts better than anyone else. So I'm not going to put my personal experience there just because I prove not to be so. I'm not saying that's necessarily running me the whole weekend, but I have become aware of that program this morning.
What happened to dialogue?
Huh?
Isn't a lot of what we're doing here attunement, in the sense of getting towards a happy group on one plane or another? And isn't there something else to do, which is to, if we're looking for an understanding, then maybe it's not necessary to be attuned from the start. Maybe we can progress to understand a certain subject which we're dealing with, which in this case is meaning itself. Whatever we're working on, I won't try and define it now. And in progressing towards that, if we manage to listen and participate correctly, we can understand something further without necessarily. There's respect in that. There's not feeling that I'm the same as the next person beside me, or that I have fears or I don't, and these aspects.
I don't really understand what you're saying.
I do. Might not be the same thing.
It's only because there's a theory, but there's every chance it is.
I felt I could understand it in terms of an orchestra who tune up to begin before they can have a concert. I was thinking of the fact that it's the oboe that sounds the note, thinking that perhaps David was the oboe to get us into tune. Then we can start playing. So we need to
There's a dozen different understandings. So I don't agree to. But my understanding was that to understand one needs a properly scientific approach. And science is defined as disciplined skepticism. Therefore, Christian and self-Christian is not to be disdained. This is what it's all about.
I was hoping that you see that perhaps there are some people who don't agree with it. There are some people holding back because they feel there's a general consensus. That's one question.
No, I personally not find it very easy to get in on this dialogue because I'm the sort of person who reacts fairly slowly to other people's conversation, and I felt that I haven't by and large had enough space to get in. And I imagine many other people here too may feel exactly the same. It would be helpful if there were some spaces, somewhat longer spaces after each person's contribution. So those who haven't yet had a chance to come in could come in. Two other things I want to say. One is about techniques of dialogue. It seems to me that there are possibilities for dialogue other than meeting face to face. I can give two possible examples. One example would be suppose a newsletter is distributed to different people who want to participate in the dialogue that is to arise out of a newsletter. Then they can send their contributions in writing in their own time to the popularizer of that newsletter, and those contributions can be then redistributed via the newsletter. That is one possibility. Another interesting possibility which has recently been made feasible by information technology is what is called a computer conference. You have the same sort of thing occurring there, only it can happen at a rather faster pace because of any person in a computer conference can put a contribution into the central computer system at any moment he or she feels like it. Once it's in the system, anybody else in the system can access it. So there are interesting possibilities here for further exploration after we've finished this conference. I'm not suggesting we discuss these ideas further now. I'm suggesting we take them back with us and see what use we might be able to make of them at a later time. The final point I want to make is that it seems to be that contact with the higher self can occur both within a group, but it can also occur at the individual. Individuals can have that contact occasionally, directly. This can make quite a difference to our lives.
Maybe I'd like to bring something that David was saying about bringing consensus and so we'll hold it back, because I think all this question about higher self or the unlimited, I think this is what the problem is. I think that's the problematic side, and I feel there's a sort of tendency to presuppose it and bring that up, and I think it's useful as a metaphor. I think in our small group we had a good go with it, some kind of metaphor that can open up things. But I'm not sure we are always, when we are using these, we are aware, are we using them as a metaphor, a way of illustrating, or saying that there is actually a higher self and we just tune into that. And because I feel that sort of bypasses maybe the area where the problem is, or jumps the gun, or whatever. I personally tend to feel that we can be very passionate and angry and aggressive about in a tacit way about the unlimited, even when we say that whatever we say about it, and even when we say that the other is not important, it's not important all this thought and felt and thinking, feeling, or these unforgivable feelings we have, but we should get along with this unlimited, and I feel even there you can may sense a kind of a tacit aggression behind it, and we can feel angry about the fact that we are here learning about anger. Peter has had a very good example of something. So that would be my feeling. That if we, I think David said recently that this would be a way of looking for an insight to what is going on in the world. And I think in doing that, we should be clear what the problem is, which I think would be that because of the confusion now, the unlimited isn't working. It may be working for us individually, but in the world as a whole, it's not working. And maybe sort of be careful not to jump ahead there and see whether we actually feel clear about this thought belt. If we haven't sort of feeling that that's not bothering us, that's not between us.
Could we then come back as the microcosm here of what is out there to the input that was made over there about us being in the predicament of being stranded? And perhaps there is absolutely nothing we can do except discover what resources we can share. Now, I experience myself as a flaming vortex, but I know I don't look like that. Me when I look in the mirror, or when I present myself to it. But that's the resource I have, is I am a flaming vortex, not a muddled puddle. That's my contribution here now. Spend it on the beach.
I'd like to reiterate something that various people said in the group I was in last night. They were very dissatisfied. The whole weekend they were saying, I've got no problem. I don't have to sort out. I meditate. I'm okay. And yet here we are saying, well, stuff, and it's all wonderful, and everyone's agreeing. There's no dissension or camps arising. But there are people here, I feel, more than just the people I heard speaking last night, who are not satisfied with what's happening here this morning.
My question is, why did your group, or why did we all come here? You know,
well, maybe
I could understand some people came for professional reasons, their work, publishing, or psychotherapy and things like that. But even in that case, I think there are other secondary reasons why they came. And I think the fact that they don't want to admit or recognize the reasons why they came, perhaps that's the problem.